Staring at herself in the mirror on the restroom door. Voices in her head that mirror what she's heard before.
Hey beautiful people, it's your girl Shakima. I'm just stopping in for the launch of Warrior Wisedome, which is a new segment that I'm launching here on my YouTube channel this and every Wednesday. Fingers crossed, we'll see how this goes, where I'm able to just drop a little bit of gems for you guys, give you guys a little bit of insight. I've been thinking about this for some time, and I did a free one question reading last Friday, and this particular video, I guess, is inspired by Marie, one of the actual people that was in the lives. If you guys missed that, I am going to be live again this Friday, 9:30 p.m. GMT, so be sure to set your reminder for that. It's also already up on my channel, so you can just set a reminder on the actual video itself. Shameless plug, yes guys. But for Warrior Wisedome, it's really just to give you guys some insight into some of the spiritual conversations that we have and really dissect it so that we can digest it. And today's topic, my loves, inspired by Marie, is the ego, because there's a lot of misconceptions about the ego, and I feel like it is very much misunderstood in a lot of different ways. It's misrepresented in a lot of different ways. So I wanted to come into this space and, like I said, dissect it so that we can digest it, okay? So before we go ahead and get into the video, guys, definitely be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you resonate with the content, and if you like my vibe, feel free to join the tribe. I'd love to have you. And hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you can be kept in the know of when I do upload these awesome videos for you guys. All of that awesomeness out of the way, guys, be sure to comment down below at the end of this to let me know if you did get any new insights, or if there's anything that I said that kind of sparked a new way of thinking in the smallest or fractional of way, or maybe in a grand way for some of us, okay? So we're going to go ahead and get into it without further ado. Let's kick this off. Right, guys, so speaking on the ego, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstandings and misrepresentation of the actual ego. Now, according to Freud's psychoanalytical theory, we have the id, which is actually the primitive and instinctual parts of ourselves, and this oftentimes is what we identify as the ego. From my personal understanding, I observe the ego as the editor of the mind. Okay, the ego is more or less the realistic part of ourself that kind of mediates between our human self and our higher consciousness. So the ego actually has a very challenging job a lot of the times. And when we're dealing with the id, which can be very much fixed in its perspective, we identify that a lot of the times as the ego. But let's not forget the superego as well. The superego is actually the more moral, conscientious part of ourselves. We consider this to be the conscience, which that's more of the rational, I guess, part of our mind that is able to really give us a moral understanding of certain situations that we find ourselves in. And a lot of the times when we're dealing with the id, which oftentimes is confused as the ego, it's very primitive, it's very fixed in its perspective, and it is very stubborn in a lot of different ways. It can be very rigid in its perspective. And again, this is more the primitive nature of our human selves. So when we're speaking about the id, we're speaking about some of our trigger responses. So what naturally happens when we are triggered in situations. Now we think that we're, fixed in our ego, but in psychoanalytical terms, we're actually fixed in our id. Now the id is very much an I, self-serving being, okay? Whereas the superego is more of a collective, corporative being of understanding. It's more of our conscientious aspect of ourselves that is able to see not just our perspective, but also the perspective of the collective in certain situations, right? Now, when we talk about the ego itself is simply the editor. It is the middleman that is trying to find the balance between the human self and the higher self, i.e., the spiritual being that occupies the vessel that is your avatar, your body. Now, a lot of the times when we find ourselves in situations where we're in a fixed perspective, because the ego is simply perspective, it is the editor of perspective. Now, when we are pretty much in our lower selves, our human primitive nature of ourselves, we can sometimes tend to be very fixed in our perspective. And the ego's job is to be able to identify a way to expand upon that id version of the story, because the superego or conscience actually has a broader perspective on the situation. And a lot of the times our id is based on a lot of our childhood traumas. It is based upon a lot of our even adult traumas, to be perfectly honest with you. The id is naturally shaped by some of the situations that we actually find ourselves in at any given stage of life. So the id is all about the I, the superego is all about the we, and the ego itself is actually about the you and I. Okay, the ego is not this being that needs to be killed off, or this part of ourselves that needs to be killed off. That's actually one of the biggest misconceptions. We do have what is considered ego deaths, yes. What that simply means is that we are going through a paradigm shift, which means that we're going from one perspective, which is more than likely the id perspective, into the superego perspective, which has more of a expansive vision on the actual narrative of the story. The id is very much, like I said, a self-serving aspect of our psyche. So it focuses solely on how we've been harmed, how we've been affected, how we're being infected by certain situations that we actually find ourselves in. And the id, a lot of the times, tends to victimize itself, which is why we require the superego, which is our higher state of consciousness, to be able to allow for us to have a broader perspective. Now, working with the id, the ego, and the superego is very important, very, very, very important for the evolution process. Now, I want to be able to sort of break this down so that you, my friend, can actually utilize the information as you move on into your days, and really rework some of your psyche on certain situations, right? So when you find yourself in situations where you're very fixed in your perspective, you're feeling very much like you're in survival mode, because that's what happens with the id when we are triggered. We go into our primitive state, which means that we are in survival mode, which means that our body has now identified with an old programming of trauma. Now that our body is identified with that old programming, it is simply trying its best, I guess, to be able to avert the same outcome as what we experienced in the past that caused this instinctive trauma. Now, fight or flight mode is what kicks in when we're dealing with the id. And the id, in most cases, a lot of the times when we have the clash of the ego, we're in fight mode. Okay, we want to fight our point. We want to, get the other person to see our perspective, but we have no understanding of what they're trying to say, and we have no opening about what it is that they would like for us to see as far as their perspective. Now, what needs to happen in those situations is that we have to ground ourselves in the ego being the editor. So now we need to identify how we're actually going to edit this story that we're telling, how we're going to narrate the story differently. And a lot of the times we're only focused on our perspective when we're telling our story. When we are dealing with other people, it's very important to take their experience into consideration as well. Now, this is where the superego comes into play, where the superego gives us an opportunity to be able to expand upon the vision and engage in some level of understanding or some level of awareness of the other person's perspective. When you find yourself in situations where your id is very fixed and it has attached a very primitive perspective to your ego, the editor of your mind, the best thing that I'd say depends on what it is that your id is in fear of, because the id, again, is our primitive state. So a lot of the times this governs our fears and our caution. Whereas the superego governs our joy, our love, and our unconditional love for life itself and the people around ourselves. And it's really a case of trying to balance that out a lot of the times. Now, when our human gets into a fixed state of feeling as though it has been triggered, first thing to do in that situation is identify this is not your ego, this is your id. Now, finding the balance, sitting within your ego, being the editor of your mind's eye, the editor of your psyche and experiences, sitting within your ego, trying to understand what can I learn about this situation in comparison to my past experiences. That's number one. Why has this experience shown up? To teach me something about my past trauma, because a lot of the times when we find ourselves in situations where we have been triggered, we kind of play out a lot of the same old patterns in situations, because naturally we go into fight or flight mode. And if we go into fight mode, we're going to get the same response. And if we go into flight mode, we're going to get the same responses as well. So what we can do in those types of situations is to identify what opportunity we are being given to actually shift the narrative of our past trauma, because our body has now gone into this primitive state because we've activated a certain genetic genome code. What do I mean by that? So when we're in the id, say for instance, you are somebody who is used to, from your childhood experiences, being dismissed. Okay, so in some cases, you may have had a situation or several situations, depending on your upbringing, where, you know, the old way of doing things is that a child should be seen and not heard. So if you come, I guess, from that era, or you had to deal with parents or grandparents from that era or generation, it somehow teaches your psyche that what you have to say is invalid, and you are naturally dismissed. So what happens is that in your adult life, when you feel as though you're actually being dismissed in a situation where perhaps you haven't clearly articulated your point, or you haven't been able to be received as far as your perspective in the way that you would like, it causes you to go into this triggered state of the previous trauma, of feeling as though you have been dismissed in this particular situation. Not entirely true. That is a half-truth told by the id, because it is in its primitive state, and its sole purpose and ambition in that moment is to basically have its perspective be seen, heard, received, and validated. Now, what one can do in that situation is to be able to actually say, do you know what? What is it that you're not actually getting from what I've said? Because a lot of the times when we feel as though we're being dismissed, in most cases, we're actually giving that energy out there. So we, in turn, actually have to shift the vibration of our perspective. So shift the energy that we're actually giving. So we actually have to be more receptive so that we can be received in a clearer channel of communication, right? So as you find yourself in those types of situations, whatever it feels that your id is lacking, you give that to the person that you are engaging with. Okay, it may not necessarily be an instinctive turnaround for that person, because they might still be in their id, okay, in their id perspective, the me perspective. So it might take a few minutes for the old energy to flatline, so that you can create a new wave of communication. So it's about continuing to give that which you intend to receive from others. Okay, so if you're intending to receive honesty from somebody else, you need to be absolutely honest. And you may be 80% honest and you're telling this narrative that you're always honest with the person. That's not true. You are 80% honest, my love, because the universe is asking you to stand in conviction of what it is that you're requesting. Okay, if you want 100% honesty from somebody, you cannot give 80% honesty and expect 100% honesty in response. The universe is asking you to up your honesty game, my love, okay, so that you can receive more honesty in return and response to that. Okay, when we're dealing with a superego, it is absolutely amazing for us to be able to tap into our moral compass. Okay, so a lot of the times when we're going clash of the egos, where we're dealing with this combative energy, where we're in fight mode, the superego is actually wanting to give love to the situation. It's actually wanting to give understanding, compassion, empathy. But a lot of the times we get fixed in the id, that we struggle to be able to see the identification of the superego. So when you find yourself in those types of situations, take a minute to breathe, because that does oxygenate the mind, which also gives life to the ego itself, the editor of the mind's eye. And that gives you an opportunity then for the superego to start to engage in conversation with the id. Let's lose this narrative that the ego is something that is this evil being that is basically out for itself, and is pretty much just a selfish person or a selfish aspect of ourselves. Ego deaths have to happen. It's important for the evolution process, yes. It's important for our paradigms to shift if we are going to shift into new realities and different experiences and different versions of ourselves, absolutely. However, the ego itself is simply the editor, okay? It's like blaming somebody for something that you have actually done. The ego actually gets a lot of blame for the id's perspective, and the ego is simply here to be able to mediate between the id and the superego. The superego being the observation of collective consciousness, the id being the observation of self within collective consciousness, which can get very primitive sometimes, simply because when we engage with people, situations can become very, very tricky very quickly, depending on how aware we are of some of our past traumas. So when we do activate some of our trauma codes within our genetic genome, because muscle memory is a real thing. We don't just remember, the nostalgia of certain tracks or melodies. We actually have a lot of memory. Everything is actually stored within our body, and it's connected to the subconscious. The superego, in most cases, is also connected to the subconscious mind as well as the conscious mind, whereas the id is solely focused on the conscious mind. It is solely focused on what it is aware of in that moment, which is why it's important for the ego to then help the id to shift its perspective by broadening its horizon on the story, broadening the perspective, broadening the narrative of the story, so that it can be more of an experience that is serving to everyone and not just the self, not just the I. Okay. What I would like to close out this space by saying, because a lot of the times, there's a saying that the ego is edging God out as an acronym, right? I don't know if Ralph Smart coined that term. If you guys don't know Ralph Smart, guys, definitely check him out here on YouTube. I think it's actually just a natural part of the journey when you awaken as a spiritual being to actually get connected to Ralph Smart. Lovely guy, amazing energy, great content here on YouTube. So definitely go ahead and check his stuff out. But the ego isn't necessarily edging God out. And when we say God, we're potentially speaking about the superego. The id, in more cases, is the fixed perspective where the God within ourselves, the good observing the darkness, God as an acronym, the good observing the darkness doesn't necessarily have a say, I guess, in the id's perspective. Okay, so the id is simply focused on the human experience, what's taking place in the there and now, and what essentially needs to happen for it to feel like a safe environment. When you find yourself feeling unsafe, that means that you have activated a trauma code within your body. Now that you have activated that trauma code, amazing, right? Instead of looking at it like a negative, we look at it as a positive. This is a great opportunity for me to shift this coding. This is a great opportunity for me to elevate this genetic genome within myself so that it can be more of a vibrational match to the timeline that I'm trying to create. Because a lot of the times it's our past traumas that actually holds us back from our future timelines of greatness, right? Because we're constantly engaging in the dance that the id is engaging with, based on the narrative that it's telling on the story that you're experiencing in your now, determined by some of your past experiences. So it's important that you identify the language that you're using in that moment. So if you're speaking from a place of you always this and you never that, it's safe to say that you're in your id primitive mode. And what happens in that mode is that now that you are in the trauma of whatever it is that this person is activating within yourself, you may be feeling neglected, unheard, misunderstood, all of these things, right? This is taking you back into a old programming within your childhood. There's a particular memory that has been activated within your genetic genome. Now, what you can do in that situation is to identify what memory is actually engaging with this particular present moment for it to feel this restrictive, for it to feel this rigid, for it to feel as though you're back in that place where you're powerless to the situation. Because a lot of the times why we have trauma from our childhood is, based on that fact, because we feel powerless to the decisions that the adults around us make. And we simply just have to go along with their choices. Now, what you do in that moment is, again, take a minute to just oxygenate the mind. Okay, breathing is how we work this body. It is how we work the avatar. It is actually how we are able to continue to live, in essence. Okay, once we stop breathing, life itself has left the body. It takes about maybe up to seven minutes or so for the consciousness to actually leave the body, once we have, I guess, stop breathing, because the heart stops, but the mind actually continues for up to 7 minutes later, because we're collecting all our files from this body, so that we can take the information on, to be assessed, I guess, for the next lifetime, in terms of what it is that we've learned from this experience and what we need to continue to do in order to grow, learn, and evolve in our next lifetime. So when you find yourself being activated, fear not, my love. This is an opportunity for you to be able to shift the vibration of that trauma within yourself and create a new norm, create a new story. And whatever it is that you feel as though you are not getting, the thing that you need to do in that situation is give that to the person because basically the universe is saying that you're low on that, whatever it is. The universe is saying, okay, you haven't given this to this person, so unfortunately I cannot allow for this person to give something back to you that you haven't necessarily invested in them. Okay, and you might feel as though, oh, I did it for you previously, I did it for you last week. You're not doing it in this particular moment that you're experiencing with that person. So what you need to do is give what it is that you're actually wanting from that person, so that the universe can then give that back to you in return from that very same individual. And sometimes it may not actually, depending on where that individual is with their experience between their id, ego, and superego, they may not actually even be the one to give that to you. The universe might actually find somebody else outside of that dynamic who is more of a vibrational match to basically delivering to you what you're asking for from that person. So just be open for the universe to deliver to you what it is that you're asking for in the very best way possible. It's not necessarily always going to happen in the way that you would hope that it would happen, but it's going to happen in the best way possible to allow for you to continue to expand your consciousness, to allow for you to continue to grow, to allow for you to continue to evolve, my loves. Okay, I hope that was useful for you guys. This was intended to be a fairly short video, but here we are. There's a lot to actually dissect with that. Hopefully you're able to digest the understanding of the psyche when it comes to the id, the ego, and the superego, because they are multi-layered aspects of ourselves that is all engaging with our experience at any given time. And being human is hard. Okay, we take it for granted because, we're constantly striving for all of these things in the external world. But it's a very, very challenging process being a human, because there's so many layers. A human is a very multifaceted being. And a lot of the times we're focused on one facet when there's multi-layers of that facet actually at play. So I'm sending you all of the love, light, and openness as you continue to expand your ego, as you continue to grow your ego, as you continue to shift your paradigms emotionally, psychologically, and physically as a result of those emotional and psychological changes. Okay, my loves, on that note, I'm going to love you guys and leave it there for you guys. I am sending you guys all that you need to be able to overcome whatever it is that you're navigating through right now as far as the ego, because it is simply here to aid you in your human experience, provided that you're actually willing to grow. Okay, my loves, on that note, I'll see you guys in the next video. I'm gonna love you guys and leave it there for you guys. Namaste. Mwah. Take care, guys. full joy the actual experience of being human, because although it may be hard and challenging, it's a beautiful experience with so many amazing ways to be able to evolve as a being of divinity. Okay, if the video has been useful for you guys, definitely be sure to comment down below and let me know what you actually were able to take away from this video. If you do like my vibe, guys, like I mentioned, be sure to join the tribe and subscribe. I'd love to have you, and hit the notification bell, that way you can be kept in the know when I do upload these awesome videos for you guys, because we're going to make this a thing moving forward. Okay, my loves, on that note, I'll see you guys in the next video. Ta-ra, guys, take care.
They said to hold her back, they never seem to leave her head and tend to keep her mind at war.